All right, how's that?
That's how we do it.
It wouldn't be, yeah, it wouldn't be a pandemic. It wasn't some sort of glitch with the virtual program. But I just wanted to say first off how grateful I am, and I think I speak for everyone who is blessed to see this film, to Korey, because this is tremendously powerful, painful, disturbing, and absolutely necessary for America to see. And so we're going to have a conversation today over the next 45 to 50 minutes with Korey Isbell, the filmmaker, also with Greg Bryant, a descendant of Floella McDonald, who was talked about in the film, Stephanie Harp, a descendant of a 1927 Pulaski County sheriff, and then Matthew Charity, Barbara Barclay, Heather Hampton, and Kwami Abdul-Bey, all four who are descendants of Frank and Lonnie Dixon. So at JCA and at APJMN, we believe that the United States has never honestly confronted our racial history, including examining the legacy of racial terror lynching. Learning about, confronting, reckoning with this truth of our history provides us with the opportunity, or should provide us with the opportunity, to understand the roots of the injustices we face today and how those injustices continue to impact communities of color, particularly the Black community. So what I want to do is I want to start off and offer a question to the descendants, and then I want to end this first round with a question for Korey. So I'm going to let the descendants go, and I'd like you to respond to the question. If you could just reflect on a moment or statement in that film that particularly stuck out to you, that's particularly personal to you, and share that with the group and why. And then we'll end with Korey. If you could talk about what challenged you the most about making this film. So let's start with the descendants, or we can start, let's start with Kwami. Can you reflect on one particular moment of the film that stuck out to you and why that's so important to you personally? And then we'll go on with the rest of the descendants. And then Korey, if you could tell us what was the most challenging part of making this film.
Well, really what stuck out to me was, if you notice, when I started talking about my great-grandfather, Frank Dixon, never being seen again, still to this day, as I'm even thinking about it right now, it really hurts, because I've spent most of my life just wondering what happened to him. And I've even written, short stories on what if he went and did this, what if he went and did that. I even had myself believing when I was in my 30s that he was actually Farad Muhammad, and he founded the Nation of Islam. So
Thanks, Kwami. Who else?
We could just go across the screen, I guess. I'll go next.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie.
It was my great grandfather was a deputy sheriff, and I know he was present that day. I don't know anything more than the fact that he was present. I don't even know for sure that he was a deputy sheriff still at that time. He was the year before, but I haven't been able to figure that out. But anyway, the piece that struck me in the film, which was the piece that struck me the most when I was doing my own research about it, was that photograph, of course, of the officer next to John Carter's body. And when I first saw that in my own research about it, I got out magnifying glasses. I got everything out, photographs of my great grandfather. I tried so hard to be able to tell if that possibly could have been him. I don't think so. It doesn't look like him too much, but you can't tell. It's a grainy picture. I never knew my great grandfather. But that definitely was the moment in the film for me, because that was so pivotal for me already, years ago when I learned about it.
Thank you, Stephanie. Matthew, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So the point in the film that really touched me was hearing the story of what occurred in the context that I had heard it growing up from my mother when she discussed it with me. And when she discussed it, it was a kind of private thing. It wasn't something she wanted to talk about. She found the whole experience of it painful. And so, we've been kind of disconnected. I think the last time I was in Arkansas was when I was 1 back in 1975. Because my grandfather, who was actually arrested, was actually Sterling Hampton, who was Lonnie's cousin. And 3 years after this, in 1930, he moves to Brooklyn. He moves away from Arkansas. And you think about all of the history you lose. You think of the family you lose. And also, as someone growing up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and there. When we had the riots in Crown Heights. And before that, I went to school in Manhattan, and I had a friend who lived lived in the same area as the Central Park Five, who told me at the time, well, I'm hearing from people in the neighborhood that they didn't do it. And my first response when I was 14 or however old I was at the time was, well, they confessed. So, they must have done it, because why would you confess to something you didn't do? And I think that there was a lot of pain around believing that someone must have done something really horrible, even when you hear again and again, well, that's not really what happened. So I think hearing that story, hearing that the part that we heard in our family that they weren't involved, it gave me confidence that those problems that occurred then. And I'm certainly sorry that anyone was hurt and was killed. It's a horrible thing. But the fact that that people are repeating the story that we have always heard, it gives me some comfort that that history doesn't forget.
Thank you.
Pipe in. Unlike my cousin, I had just heard about this story from my mother probably about a month or two ago. And something that struck me, Sterling Hampton was my grandfather also, and who was also arrested along with Lonnie Dixon. What struck me watching this were some of the images of the men and possibly women being lynched. I remember being a young girl in my parents' house. In our living room, we had this book called The Black Book. And I remember taking it down from our bookshelf and flipping through it. And there were pictures of these same lynchings in this book. And I remember being very young. I think I was around 10 when I first saw them, and being horrified. And that little girl that they showed at the end, who was dressed up in her Sunday best, watching with a smile on her face, it horrified me that this little girl could find so much pleasure watching a human being being brutalized like that, even at my young age. So that's the one thing I thought about as I was watching this. I'm 48 now, and just remembering being a young girl and seeing these images. And now knowing that one of my ancestors was connected to something like this just horrifies me. So that was my thought going, just watching this, just remembering that thought when I was younger.
Me now?
Barclay, or if you don't mind, or Greg?
Okay. I'm Barbara Hampton-Barclay, and I am the daughter of Sterling Hampton, who was Lonnie's first cousin. And my mother told me about the incident. My parents divorced when I was about 2 years old. And my mother always said that one of the reasons he was an alcoholic and that he was in such a psychological tizzy was an incident that happened when he was a teenager. And that's when she told me the story of Lonnie, and that the family had to go into hiding. And I couldn't envision, what do you mean go into hiding? And she said they did. They had to go into hiding because people were looking for other members of the family to lynch since they hadn't been able to get their hands on Lonnie. And then I spoke about it. I never believed it. I just didn't believe it. And then as I started doing ancestry and getting to know my relatives more, I read more about Lonnie, and I said, that doesn't make sense. If you kill someone, why would you put them in the bell tower where you worked? And I also heard that they were going out together, that he was a boyfriend of hers. The ages they change as you read each book. One is 13, one is 14, one's 15, etc. But my father was 3 years younger than Lonnie, and I hear they were good friends. Well, my grandfather brought my father up to Brooklyn. I don't know. My mother says to get away from what was going on in Arkansas. And eventually his father and mother divorced. And then my father came here. And all I know about him is that he was pretty irresponsible. And my mother always said, she never, blamed him and said he was horrible or whatever, but she always said that she felt the incident in Arkansas had played a part in his lack of responsibility and in his fears and in his alcoholism. So I, again, began doing research in ancestry, and Heather and I were talking one day and I mentioned it, and my good old Nancy Drew daughter said she was going to investigate. And sure enough, she did. She ended up finding Kwami. As a result of finding Kwami, I have found my cousins, and it's just wonderful. I never knew that I had that much family. I had heard of them, but I didn't know that they still existed and whatever. And we have a page, and we're trying to figure out who everybody belongs to. And my older sisters remember. In fact, my sister Jackie, Matthew's mom, she told me that Frank had been escorted out of town by the police, and that they had dressed him in a police uniform so that he could get out of the town, and that's the last anyone ever saw of him. So that's the story. I think it's fascinating. And again, I never knew my Southern roots.
And that's the first time I've ever heard of the dressing them up as a police officer. So thank you for that tidbit.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish Jackie was here. She's the oldest sister, and so she knows a lot. And but I couldn't figure out how to get her on. I couldn't figure out how to get myself on.
We're glad you did.
Yeah.
Thank you. Greg, what about you?
You're mute.
Unfortunately, I only saw the last minute of Mr. Isbell's what appears to be a very good film. And what's also disappointing is my middle son, who was sitting just about 5 feet from me, is his freshman year at Rhode Island School of Design in the film school. And I think he would have really enjoyed at least seeing the film and talking to Mr. Isbell. I think what I said, Stephanie, was it 3 years ago in February, or?
It was in 2013. So it was, time flies, right?
There's 3 in there somewhere. And I got kind of emotional about it because I quoted my Aunt Margaret saying that the article in the paper, and it was my Aunt Margaret's personality to say that about her young sister, or teenage sister. She's in a better place now. I mean, it wasn't. I never heard any hateful things about Lonnie Dixon. What I did hear, and was that he was the son of the maintenance worker at First Presbyterian, Second Presbyterian Church, that he did suffer from some mental disabilities, and that is something that I don't know that's ever really been established. That may have been just something that was said during the very, very, very few times that my family talked about this. Anytime it was talked about, it was me who was seeking the information. But my interest became increased when I was in high school, because it was mentioned in a history class one time in my junior year, and what happened? What was the story that was generated? Was that that the person that was lynched was lynched, but he was the one who is supposedly who was killed Floella McDonald, and that's not what happened. But I didn't volunteer that, hey, listen, that was, I'm related, I'm connected with that somehow. I didn't advertise it, and as I say today, I don't really like having the dubious distinction of having some connection to the last reported lynching in the state of Arkansas. But what I said back in 2013 about this that affected me was that learning that my classmate and my friend Clay Moorhead, finding out in 2013 what I didn't know back in 1970 or 1968 to 1971, and Clay and I were friends. I mean, she was a member of my. I was editor of the high school yearbook, and Clay was on the staff, and but we always seemed to have a connection, and never knew why. But what I said back in 2013 was that there was always a little piece of this case, a little piece of this story, this tragedy, that I became a criminal defense attorney. What happened then? A 15-year-old wouldn't receive the death penalty. A person with mental challenges wouldn't receive the death penalty. But the sad thing about it is the particular law, it ain't new. I mean, that law is about 10 years old. So from 1927 to 2005 maybe, it's taken that long to get to that point. Stephanie, am I leaving anything out about what was?
I think I'll explain in just a second what he's talking about here, but Greg, I think one point that was pivotal that night was that you said that Lonnie's death was illegal lynching. I remember that was something that Kwami's mother and aunt both said was really important to hear
and
from your lawyer's perspective.
I don't know if that was said in Mr. Isbell's film, and I thought, well, maybe they were there that night. I don't know, but I certainly don't take credit for that being an original thought of mine. I'll say that.
Thanks, Greg. And we'll hold on. We're going to come back to that legal aspect and its relation to the film. But I want to talk to the filmmaker and creator of this experience really we just had. Again, I'm so grateful for that. And Korey, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what led to the making of this film, but then tell us about what was the most difficult thing for you, because I can't imagine the myriad of things that were challenging and difficult in making this kind of film. But if you could tell us what was most difficult for you and why.
Okay. First of all, I'm completely honored to be here. Thank you to Kwami and Clarice and Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement. I'm honored to have you all viewing this and sharing your emotions and views. It's kind of mind blowing. But this project started probably a year ago when I was looking for a 2020 project. I was been a filmmaker. I've done television. I've done national television. I've made short documentaries, but I wanted a project to kind of own myself for this year. And while looking for subjects, I had a conversation with my 17-year-old son. And it may have been during the riots. No, it was before George Lynch, but something came up and he had no clue of the history of the treatment of Black people in the United States. From the characters to the Disney films that mocked us to just the treatment of Black people in the United States, because it had been completely eliminated from textbooks in today's classrooms. So that sparked me wanting to do something on race relations and Black people's treatment in the United States. So initially, I wanted to tell a story of the Little Rock Nine. I wanted this to be a national documentary, but due to budget constraints, because this was 100% independent film, everything, it was me. I didn't have any kind of financial help from any big groups or organizations. So I was going to do a story on the Little Rock Nine, and Mother Annie Abrams, who you all may know, but she's huge in the Arkansas civil rights movement, friends with Daisy Bates. I met her through a friend and was discussing this with her, and we discussed the Little Rock Nine and doing the film on it. And it just wasn't moving the way I wanted it to. And Mother Abrams called me over to her home one day because her birthday was coming up and she wanted me to take some pictures of her. And of course, I'm going to go when she calls me to take some pictures of her. And we were out, I was helping her out to her front yard by her trees that she wanted to take the pictures by. And she mentioned the church where they pulled the pews out of in the lynching of John Carter. And it triggered something in my head that, wait a minute, why am I trying to tell a story that's been told over and over and over? I want to tell stories that hadn't been told because I had no clue of this that happened right, in my backyard. So I started researching and reading, and I think the first person I was able to get a hold to was Dr. Kenneth Barnes, and he kind of led me to Kwami, who kind of led me to the next person and to the next person. And it all, kind of came together for me. And it's interesting because anytime I do a film or a video, a music video, a promotional video, once I have all my shots and everything, I'm really excited to get to the computer and tell the story, start crafting it based on what I had in my head. But with this project, it was months of interviews and getting backstories and putting everything together. And once I finally had it all together, I set it down and I couldn't do anything. I don't know I guess I was just overwhelmed by the massive amount of tragedy, I guess, that happened with all of it. So in turn, I set it to the side and I had to physically motivate myself to get up, get in front of the computer and tell this story the way that I know I can. And I knew I wanted to make it raw. I wanted to make it real. I wanted to make it, I wanted people to feel something by seeing the injustice that happened in this case. But to answer your question, the most challenging part of this, I guess, was the mental fatigue, I guess, from and not even knowing that's what it was, but the mental fatigue from this and other stories like this that I heard. And I guess something inside me, once I finally got all the pieces together, I just kind of shut down for like a month and a half. And I finally dragged myself in front of the computer. And, I give credit to God because he kind of tells the stories through me. And when I sit down, it's kind of easy for me to kind of listen and let things flow in natural format. But it was definitely the biggest challenge was, I guess, the overall exhaustion from these stories.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I obviously could not imagine. And, Kwami and Clarice and I do a lot of work in racial equity education and facilitation. And we often talk about, for our Black colleagues and Black friends, the vicarious trauma that is experienced when you hear the stories of not only the reality of current Black people, but when you really start to learn the history and how difficult that be. So that's one of the reasons I posed that question, because I just wanted to highlight that, and which to me highlights your courage and your vulnerability in making this film. That leads me to my next question, which we've got a few lawyers on the call, and you'll have your chance, but I want to ask the non-lawyers to answer this question first. It took until 2018 to pass legislation that made lynching a federal crime. Can you discuss why you think it took more than a century to make that change in our country?
You asking me?
You and the non-lawyers get to go first.
I'm gonna let a non-lawyer go first.
Are you a lawyer too, Korey?
No, I'm one of the non-lawyers.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a non-lawyer.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Mom.
I think, and I get a lot of flack about this, but one of the things I felt is that in teaching, I was on the other one before this, and they were talking about Black people as victims. And I think what happens with me anyway, is that in learning about African-American history, as they call it, it ends up being about slavery and victimization. I think that as a result of that, there are a lot of white people, less pigmented people, who then see us as victims. And so when you see somebody, when you've been raised to believe that somebody is a victim, that somebody is beneath, you or whatever, I think that's the way the police and people respond to Black people. And so I think that I don't think there was this great desire to change that image. And even now, I still find that I'm currently writing a curriculum for African American History Month. And it's interesting because last year at African American History Month, I said, I'll have it done by next year. But my God, every time I turn around, I find somebody that I have never heard of. I discovered that there were something like 150 Black towns incorporated and by Black people where they were successful and they lived well and whatever. Never learned any of that in African American history. I discovered lawyers and politicians and whatever, that the senator from South Carolina was the first federal senator, and all of this stuff is never told. So people look upon Black people as victims. And in many ways, we are taught to look upon ourselves as victims. Now, I do think we've been victimized, but I think there needs to be a balance. And I think our kids need to know that slavery, I don't include slavery in my curriculum. I think slavery is white history. To me, that's not Black history. We didn't do that to ourselves. So I go from Africa to the diaspora, and then I pick up with emancipation. And I can honestly tell you, I've just become so very proud seeing all of the the people who did things. There were teachers who went and taught children after emancipation. I don't know. I've just been amazed by the positive aspect of African American history. So I think there needs to be a balance. And again, as I said, when it came to Lonnie, I never believed it, although my sister told me that the family believed it. And again, I wonder why would they? And the only reason that that the people in the town, the church, and the people who were in the different organizations, that they believed it also, that he was guilty. And I wondered about that. Why would they jump on the track that he was guilty? So I think in many cases that that we think of ourselves as victims, and I think that has to stop.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. What about you, Heather?
I was recently watching this documentary about why can't I think of his name right now? Michael Brown. And what struck me is how Michael Brown sat dead in the street for 4 hours before they removed his body. His mother sat there crying and screaming, that's my son. So in front of his mother, in the heat of summer, this boy is dead in the street in front of all these people. It was so disgusting to me for 4 hours. And my thought is that we're not seen as human. And that's why it took so long for this legislation to be passed. I think of so many other children and women and men who have been murdered by police recently. The young boy, 12 years old, who was shot because he was playing with a toy gun, and how people made it up in their minds that, well, he looked like a man and the gun looked real and blah, blah, blah. And they made all these excuses as to why it was his fault. And yes, I agree with my mother that there's a certain victimizing of it, but I really think that it's more or less that we're not human to other people and our deaths don't matter to them. Trayvon Martin was, in my opinion, everybody says that his death was his fault because he was attacking Zimmerman, so Zimmerman had to shoot him and Zimmerman had to stand his ground. But nobody ever thinks Trayvon Martin was being chased by this man with a gun. He was minding his own business, buying tea and Skittles and going to his home. And this creepy man who he did not know was following him. So he was standing his own ground. Nobody ever thinks that way. They think that Zimmerman was standing his own ground, but nobody ever thinks that way about Trayvon Martin. So I think there is a lack of humanizing Black people. And that's why, again, it's taken so long to say, it's wrong for Black people to have been lynched and treated this way. And that's my opinion.
Thank you, Heather.
Mm-hmm.
Who else? Attorney, you guys are itching. I can see it. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit. Because you're thinking through some of the things that are individual rights and some of the things that are communitarian impulses. And if you have a group of people who are very, very upset and feel that they have been wronged, and they're going to take out that anger on someone from that group, if you are arguing that we should pass laws against that, from a political perspective, it's hard to do that because you need to have the safety valve. That means that someone is going to be sacrificed. And unfortunately, you see this again and again and again, where in order to protect some of the community norms, in order to allow people to just say, we're done with this, we can move on, we have to recognize that someone who's from an out group did the wrong thing, and we can blame them for it, and then we can be done with it. And I think you historically you can go back thousands of years and look at war and look at reprisals, right? If someone has killed a soldier, and it's someone from a town, you go into the town, and if maybe one soldier was killed, you kill 10 people. Thankfully, that's illegal now, and we've got laws against that. But there's an impulse to it, and you still get those arguments being made. Now, I don't want to get political on other issues and other places where we see that kind of continuing to occur to civilian populations. I'm teaching the death penalty in my human rights class tomorrow, so I'm going to be. I have some more stuff to talk about there, but that's why the state allows for lynching and has allowed for lynching and has allowed for it because politically it's easier to allow for it. It's very hard to stop. That's why your sheriff has to run out of town in order to avoid being killed by a mob. That's why I'm not going to get political again, but that's why sometimes you have to move out of buildings where mobs are rushing in order to protect yourself, when you should be able to say, well, that's against the law, and we have to be able to put a stop to it. No, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'll ask a follow-up question to that, and this won't be a popular statement, what I'm about to say, but I know Kwami's heard me say it before, but I think perhaps one of the most insidious elephants in the room when it comes to racism are liberal, progressive white people. And so with that said, I'm curious, I'm going to ask Kwami and Korey in particular, what role do you think apathy or just willful indifference played in what led to a system, a culture where Lonnie Dixon could be murdered like that?
Apathy on whose part? What?
Apathy on people that look like me, the white people in the community at the time.
The white liberals you're talking about. Okay. Well, it's kind of hard to not be able to not to be able to take a hold of that privilege that you were born with whenever it suits you and whenever it's to your best interest, because just as Matthew was talking about and I love the way you just described what happened on January the 6th, but it sounds pretty much like that was a lynch mob too, and the people are doing the self-preservation type thing. So white liberals who are apathetic and who do not come to the defense of these racial inequities and social injustices, they are, in my opinion, even more of the problem than the perpetrators of these particular incidents. Why they do it is a study that I'm still in the process of completing. I think it's going to take me a minute. I'll have to go to a couple of classes that Matthew teaches to kind of help me out with that, understanding that, right?
I think I'm not trying to make a particular point. I guess that, the white liberal guy like me, trying to make themselves feel good about themselves back in 1927, and I sincerely mean this, in the For What It's Worth department, there was a grand jury over the lynching, not over the murder of Floella McDonald, but over the lynching. There was a grand jury. Interesting that the grandfathers and great great-grandfathers who were involved in that grand jury, convened it, ran it, are the great-grandchildren or grandchildren of lawyers that I've practiced law with, have practiced law with for 40 years. So I guess there was that type of, let me feel good about myself for at least reaching out. Now, the grand jury also came back and with a, we don't know who did what, when, where, why, or how. So we've done our job. Sounds a little biblical, but we've done our job. He's, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
What, can I jump in for a sec?
Yeah, absolutely.
A piece I didn't say is that this learning about all of this incident of, there was a long path for me, eventually led me to graduate school where I studied it. And I did kind of a deep dive into research, and I was trying to wrap my head around what it would have been like on the ground at that time, like what kind of the question, not quite the question you're asking, but almost, that what all has converged to make this even an option that people think of, and I started looking at cultural, like radio and TV and books and, all this stuff that white people at the time would have consumed, that would have formed a mindset there. But one thing that Greg just said, in the research that I found, the grand jury, there were people, maybe these fall into this category that you're talking about, that some of the people, half the jury refused to convict and the other half submitted a letter of protest and resigned in protest to the judge, saying they're wrong they're refusing to convict and we're not going to be part of a grand jury that they refuse to even do this. So, there were people, nothing ever came of it. So that was maybe one of those like performative protest kind of things that they felt good to say that, but at least they tried to make a statement. So there's that.
Stephanie, I don't think I'm understanding. Are you talking about maybe the the transcript of the in that trial, or?
No, I'm talking about the grand jury, not the grand jury that Greg was just talking about, that convened about John Carter's death, not about Lonnie Dixon.
Okay, John Carter. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Because Lonnie Dixon's death was, legal.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wondered if we've ever been able to get a transcript of that trial or anything, because what I read is that he was convicted in 5 minutes or something, and I don't know if that's true or what.
Yeah, that's what the newspapers reported at the time, that it was 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Greg, did you ever come across a transcript of that? I know you've done a lot of that kind of research.
No, I don't. No, I think, well, that record would have been destroyed a long, long time ago. I'm sorry, there wasn't a record because there was not an appeal. He abandoned his appeal, Matthew. He signed a typewritten statement after his conviction that it had the flavor of, it purported to be something that he typed, or something that was, not, Stephanie, am I wrong?
No, yeah, there's all kind of weird stuff about really shady stuff about the confession.
Yeah, well,
yeah. He supposedly there was 3 confessions. There were 2 confessions.
And then there was also a statement saying his father did it, right? Yes.
I don't recall that. I'm not sure.
I think, yes, there was a
Oh, I
statement.
thought he said a cousin did it. I don't believe it
Okay,
was
all right.
Mr. Hampton.
Maybe
It
it's-
was-
But it wasn't that, it wasn't your relative, though, was
No,
it?
no, it's Frank
Oh,
Dixon. I thought there was, anyway, just before he was executed, he supposedly said, somebody in the adjoining cell,
Right, at Texarkana.
coaxed me into do it, saying this, or taught me what to say. What I was going to say is that about the records, very interesting. And let me give a little background. There was a fellow named Jim Ison. And Jim Ison, I knew that Jim Ison was with the Arkansas Historical Society. Jim Ison, I met back in when I was in high school, was an avowed racist. He was a friend of our journalism professor, teacher, and we came up there but Jim Ison was a student at Central High School in 1957. Now, I don't have any idea whether there's any truth to it. In fact, my suspicion is, knowing Ison as I did that few months, he made it up. But he proudly talked about that he was one of the group that urinated in a balloon and stuck it in Minnie Jean Brown's locker. And you don't know who that is. That's one of the Central High students. But and then Minnie Jean Brown retaliated by throwing a bowl of chili at him, and then she was kicked out of school. But he was working for the Arkansas Historical Society. He was very interested in this case, and all of a sudden the records disappeared when he left. And last December, I was told by the former head of the Historical Society that he was the number one suspect, that he left with as many records as he could get his hands on, and they went to his grave. So what was available is with him. And I think, Stephanie, you even had that suspicion too, didn't you?
No, not that one. I did talk to him back in 2000 about all of this, and he had written an article, which is how I located him. He'd written an article for the Pulaski County Historical Quarterly about it, with the quote from your Aunt Margaret as the title, about this whole case. And but yeah, I didn't know that about what you're saying about the records. No.
Well, Greg, I am on the board of trustees for the Arkansas Historical Association. So I have some questions at our next meeting on January 30th.
I think Allison Sanchez Hall may remember expressing her opinion who took those records last December.
Yeah, Kwami, we expect a report back on that, so make sure you.
Yeah.
Let me give you my guys' opinion real quick, because I asked a lot of people questions about those times, and lynchings were like family events. They sold cotton candy, and souvenirs with ears and teeth. And as one of the professors told me, he said, racism was as American as apple pie, and it was. I think it was people around who knew it was wrong and, didn't feel comfortable with lynchings and doing people like that, but they were just, afraid. They were, too afraid to say anything because they would be lynched too, or, called, excuse my language, nigger lovers or whatever, and they would be a part of the crowd. And I think it was a process that they had to go through to try to keep peace, a law process. But from the jump, you knew that whoever was not going to get a fair shake. They were going to get coerced into pleading guilty, and maybe even lied to. Well, if you tell me this, then we'll let you go. But actually, you signing your own death certificate, pretty much. So, and I think it even still happens today to a certain extent, where people know things that are wrong, but are just too much of a coward to say anything or do anything about it. But like you said, racism was as American as apple pie, and it still is.
I have to go. I've got people waiting on me, but I looked up in my bookshelf, and just as I was going to say this, and you got it. Well, it goes backwards. Anybody who doesn't have this book needs to get it.
The new Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And Greg, we'll send you a link to the whole entire film so you can get a chance to check everything out. I'll get your information from Kwami.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Greg, it's nice
Bye,
meeting you, Greg.
Nice to see you.
Corey, I want to ask a follow-up and kind of talk about the bigger picture of the purpose of this film, really the conception of it. You talked about your son and talking to him and realizing he didn't know about the history of racism and the specifics, especially racial terror, lynchings. So in what ways have you learned from making this film and this process that our history of racial injustice is not told, or how it's changed or masked? Or what have you learned that you would now tell your son is important about understanding the truth and why truth telling matters?
Because, yeah, and I tell him we have to talk about it to heal from these things. My purpose of these stories is not to enrage or anger, but we have to talk about it to be able to take the next step and move on from it and recognize that it has been a problem and it still is a problem. And my goal is a series of these stories. Because, you know, and it's not just necessarily lynching from hanging from a tree, but, you know, you can be lynched and vilified in all kinds of ways. And you're guilty of being Black, and it can lead to people ruining your life just for being a Black person. And it's stories all the way from slavery to lynchings to modern day, even just as recently with Trayvon Martin and George Floyd, you know, where his skin color was the reason that he's dead right now. Talking to my son and doing some research, it's like they completely deleted a chapter out of the history books. And I find it very interesting that during the George Floyd, all that thing was going on, and the president at the time and lawmakers were wanting to keep up Confederate statues and preserve that history and wanted people to remember it because that's part of America. But this part of history, they want to delete completely and don't want to talk about it anymore. I found it, you know, completely kind of crazy, you know, even some of our Arkansas lawmakers.
We call that selective amnesia.
Right, right. So I kind of, you know, and like I tell my son, and he learned a lot just from helping me with this project and doing some research with me. But we have to talk about these things, and it's not as blatant maybe now in some areas. Some areas it still is blatant, but they still have ways of vilifying Black people, and whether it's through taxes or credit or employment or housing or healthcare, or just blatantly shooting you in the back of the head, you know, and all because of being Black. And, you know, I have to tell my Black sons that they can't do certain things because they are Black, whether they like it or not. That's life, you know, and let's get it right the first time, because we might not get those second chances that a lot of other people get. So it's a learning process, and I feel like it is my mission to tell these stories, not only like this, but I want to travel this country and tell these stories and educate people as hard as it is. I had a friend in Los Angeles who was going to help me shop this because I want to make it into a series. But he asked me if I could, for the purpose of who do you want to talk to in LA, if I could make these less Malcolm X and more Martin Luther King. And my quote to him was, well, if I made it more Martin Luther King, the great Martin Luther King, and less Malcolm X, would it have gotten your attention and evoked the emotion that it has? And I said, no, I'm not. And he was, well, we can get a big time director to sign up, and, you know, they'll probably go for that and tell it, no, I'm not doing that either. These are my, I'm telling these stories because I'm going to be as raw and real as I can. And they're going to be diverse. You're going to see white, you're going to see Black, you're going to see whoever has an important piece of their story to tell. So,
and Korey, while you're talking about that, just go ahead and talk about the feedback that you've gotten from the film festival community on this particular short.
Recently, I submitted to several, but the first of them was the New York International Film Awards, and we were short of the month for January. And I have also sent this out to colleagues in journalism and media across the country just to get opinions before I put it out to the world. And everyone that I've sent it to has expressed how hard it was for them to watch, how powerful it was, and how these stories need to be told. So we're getting great feedback. And I know that we're going to get this series done, whether it's, I did this independently on my own, and I can do, 50 more and God will make a way if it has to happen that way. So I'm excited about telling these stories and educating people and playing a small role and hoping to change the world.
Thanks, Korey.
Can I want to add something that which is just when looking back at this time period and seeing that there were reporters from Black newspapers who were forbidden to write because of the agitation of the Black community in Arkansas, in the Little Rock area at that time. It's important to get these stories out. It's important to be able to tell them. And the difficulty is when you create an equivalency between getting people agitated about something that's true versus getting people agitated about something that's not. And so, which is something that we've been discussing in the last few weeks, right? Is people saying, we're against all riots, not just the riot at the Capitol. We're against riots. And we said it back in the summer when people were having those Black Lives Matter riots. Now, those are protests. Those are different. This is an insurrection. Again, sorry to get political, but they're different things. And so if we have historically not allowed people to be able to talk about this, or if you do talk about it, you run the risk of being viewed as an agitator yourself, as a problem maker yourself. And so it takes some courage to be able to go and talk to people and get these stories out. And so I want to thank Korey for doing that work and for doing so, even when during this period, during the pandemic, we see the rise of people who are going to act out against these stories being told.
I see a lot of these stories on PBS in our area. I live in Virginia, and we have 3 public television stations, and one independent lens has had quite a few stories about civil rights times, and then Henry Gates has his DVDs and on sequentially. And I was intrigued by your question, Donald, because I think the reason I think it took so long, I was watching Henry Gates the other night, and he had Glenn Close on, and I forget his name, David Walton, something like that. And when he went back into
Don Waters,
they discovered that each of their parents had been, or not ancestors, had been slave owners. And I think that one of the things that liberals are afraid of is that I think part of it is, in some ways, they feel guilty that they might have been involved in slavery, or if they weren't because they were white, they were somehow complicit. And so I think that there's a hidden guilt within a lot of white people about what happened. And so they come across as liberal because they feel guilty. But in reality, I used to do organization development and training for a paper company, and most of the paper mills were in the South. And it was really interesting to have me go there. In fact, my boss had originally said, I'm not going to send you there. And I said, you can send me anywhere. I can overcome you. And but it was really interesting to hear their perspective on prejudice and race and stuff like that. It was like, oh, it's always the we don't see color and everything, but but then things would come out. I'll never forget being on a wood, where was I? Might have been in Georgia or Texas or somewhere. And there were alligators all around in woods and whatever. And scared me half to death. And I'm out there training these wood people who cut down trees and make paper. And I was really scared because their attitudes were so, it was like they were telling me about these flowers. I call them black-eyed Susans. They said, oh, we call them nigger toes. And I don't, I think they think that their cause is just, and that there are those who think their cause is just. There's guilt. I think that white people have a lot of, just as black people do, there's a lot of, what's the word? Conflict, internal conflict within them around the whole thing. And I think there are white people who want this country to live up to its promise of equality. But it is very difficult to do and still fit in. I think, you were saying that being an ally to anti-racism, I've been reading some of the books by, what's his name? Somebody.
Ibram Kendi.
Indy.
Yes. He, I used to teach at American University, and he's there now. And they had all this diversity stuff, and we diversity to the ad nauseum. And I don't think it's going to make a difference until it starts, first of all, the history, until it starts younger and until it becomes real to people that Black is not something different. And I get yelled at by a lot of my friends because I don't believe in race. It's a social construct, we know that, but I don't believe in race. Everybody is a shade of brown. Some are light brown, some are dark brown, but everybody is a shade of brown. Everybody started off in Africa. Maybe they went into the woods and their skin got lighter, or maybe they went somewhere else. But this is my thing. And I think that when we do away, I personally believe that when we do away with race, we will do away with racism. So I tell all my friends when they talk about being white, I said, you're not white. This paper is white. You are not white. You are a shade of brown. There are many shades of brown and you're one of them, but you are not white. And I am not Black. I am a beautiful shade of brown, and that's who I am. So that's my thing. I do get into trouble. People get mad at me because,
Well, Barbara, just to help you out, just to let you know that what we do know of as white is not only a social construct, it is a legal construct that was created in the United States.
Yes.
In the early 1800s. I think it was either North or South Carolina court system that created what we now know as the race known as white. So.
And so living for a couple hundred years in that legal construct does create an effect of living as Black or living as white. So I just want to.
But we've got to develop a herd
immunity
around that. And I keep saying to my friends, I said, if we could get to a critical mass of people who believe that way. So I'm looking for the critical mass and the herd immunity and all of that other stuff.
Right. Who needs Dr. Fauci when we have Barbara Barclay to help?
I say that all the time.
Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that. So for this final question, I want to pose this to everybody. We talked earlier, I think, about Brian Stevenson and his work at Equal Justice Initiative. And he said, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. So I'd like for everyone to just respond. How would you and what would you say to our audience, our viewers? How do we start to win the narrative war in terms of addressing systemic racism, racialized terror lynching that, as Korey said, is still going on and even manifests itself in different industry, housing and education. So if we're to win this narrative war, as Brian Stevenson says, what would you say to our audience is how we win that war? I'll do this popcorn style. Whoever would like to go.
I'll jump in there. I know I'm not sure about, this was not enough to win it, but I think one way to start fighting that is telling the stories and talking. I mean, I come to this as a perspective as a writer and historian. And so I very strongly believe in the power of telling stories and talking to each other. And, you know, like, if it's not in the history books, why not? So put it in the history books and start teaching kids, you know, don't teach them white history, you know, teach them the history, teach them the tribal nations history, teach them all the history, because that is the only way to get the complete picture of what this country needs to do. When I read Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, as an adult out of college, blew my mind, because there was so much in there, you know, and that was, if you had told me in high school that I would end up getting a history degree, I would have like laughed. But I came to the point that when it became personal for me, you know, all of a sudden I wanted to know, well, my grandmother was 11 years old in 1927. And this was her father who had some connection to this event. So what was it like on the ground to be 11 years old, the same age as Floella, possibly, in one of the reports, you know? So that's what drove me to it, to study this and to learn about it, you know, was because all of a sudden it was personal. And if we can all of a sudden make it personal for everybody, it's not that hard. You know, telling a good history story is not that difficult. You just need to find the story that's going to connect to people. And to me, that's a starting point.
Thank you.
And I think telling those stories, just as Korey has done here so masterfully, those stories need to be told in a compelling way that is not only truthful, but is raw and unapologetic. And Korey did that with this film, which is the first in a long series, because now we have our own PBS series, Korey, to look forward to, right?
That's right. That's right.
And also another thing that I would add to that is the beauty about me sitting here and looking at 3 other people that I've only known for about a month, and we have the same blood flowing through our veins. It's very important to do those genealogical studies and not only learn about history, but learn about your history, because your history has some fascinating stories that need to come out as well.
Yeah.
Well, I will say I'm a little suspicious of those genealogical study things myself, just because you know, my wife works in national security law, and you know, she's always like, "Why are you sharing more information with the government? Why are you? If you give it to that company, you think the government's not going to have that? You think they're not going to track it down?" So there is that. There is that. But you know, I think the other thing about winning that narrative story is trying to convince people it's not in us and them zero-sum game, right? If the story that you tell hurts us, whoever we are, then I'm not going to want to listen to it. I'm going to try to shut it down. If the story that you're telling helps me be a better person, helps me interact with people better, helps me actually improve my community, then I want to know that story. But I think the problem is that a lot of people are still going to frame this as it's an us or them, and they're trying to tell you stories that are going to make you feel bad about your history. And as long as people continue to believe that, we're going to have a hard time getting past. And as long as the people who don't need their story told have more power and have more money and have more, you know, it's going to be very hard to get past that.
I agree. I think we need to continue to talk about it, but I think it's just as important that people have an ear to listen that they open their hearts to listen, to understand, to be empathetic, and to, like I said, just open yourself up to, even if it's not you or your people, to be in the position to feel maybe what they're feeling. And my goal in everything that I do, and I kind of get this from my uncle, who was a music producer in the 70s, that said, I want to make you feel something, at the end of it. I want you to feel, because if you don't feel, I didn't do my job, but you're going to feel something. And I think as a whole, people, if we can get people to open up their hearts and their ears to be able to feel and be empathetic to the common, your neighbor, your friend,
I think the ancestry thing, I really am enjoying it. Sometimes I get on there and I find myself on there at 3, and then I find myself at 11 o'clock at night still on there. But something I found interesting is one of my, how do I get rid of this? One of my cousins, my Brewer cousins, the Brewers, right? They contacted me. He contacted me, and he lives in Nashville. And it was so interesting because he had read about Jane Cage, and he says, Barbara, he says, I didn't know they allowed for intermarriage then. What church did they get married in? And I said, John, they didn't get married. He owned her. And we've been, it's interesting. There's a whole big Brewer group. They are huge. And he's the only one who's come to me, to talk about it and to get to know me. But I just find it very interesting that, as we go out, we're all so connected, and we all are part of the same family. So I think just what you're talking about is getting people to realize that it's not us. I didn't do that to their family. I did that to our family.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when I was at Columbia, I had Maxine Green. She's a philosopher, and she had us read this book, This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen. And she said, people must never forget what was done to Jews. And I said, well, Maxine, I said, if we put it that way, I can always say I never did anything to Jews. But if we say we can never forget what people have done to other people, then I'm involved. And that was something I really believe in, that we have to think of it in terms of this is what people are capable of doing to other people, and it's not what we want. So,
Oh, thank you,
And
Barb.
really, too, what I think is really important, I think somebody had mentioned it before, I think Mom, you mentioned it, is to really stop treating Black History as Slavery Month. We live in Loudoun County, and I don't know if everybody else has heard about this, but we had a class. Loudoun County has been infamous lately. We had an elementary class recently where the teachers did a gym class that was a runaway slave. They did a runaway slave, what was it, gym class or something.
so the children had to,
Huh?
the children had to run and be catched.
Yeah, they had to run and be captured, and there was an underground railroad, and the 2 Black students were slaves. And I don't know what these white teachers thought, why this would be a great idea.
Wow.
But they did. And apparently the Black students went home and told their parents, and it got out, and parents were furious. And our school system has had issues ever since. And our county has had issues ever since. There's been more than that. But I remember going to the school board and actually saying to the head of the NAACP, can we stop treating February as Slave Month? Black history is not about slavery. It was not created for slavery. It was created to highlight the great things that our ancestors have done. So there are things that I think this country needs to remember. I'm always amazed that I have white friends who have no idea that about the Tulsa massacres, Rosewood, things like that, that we had such things in this country. Even there were Chinese massacres, and they have no idea. They don't know what sundown towns are. So I'm always amazed by that because I know what it is, but I'm Black. So I do think that that's important American history. But, again, I really think that we need to stop teaching Black history as this horrible thing that, we were only slaves. We've actually done wonderful things in this country. We've built things. We've been doctors, we've been lawyers, we've been wonderful people, and we've contributed to the society. And I think once we see those contributions, then I think we will be able to move on, and this country, I think, the systemic racism, I think, will start to hopefully end.
And Donald, the final thing that I would add to your question is Clarice and I, we have for the last 10 years, we've made a concentrated effort working in the junior high schools and the high schools, particularly with George West here in Little Rock, to bring this history, this public history to the young people and teach them here, this is what it is, and have them take charge of going forward with that information and constructing it in a way that they can go share it with their families. I have in our Coming to the Table chapter here in Central Arkansas, it was actually started by two elder white men that helped Clarice and I start it. And they contacted us because their grandchildren were telling them how racist they were because what they were learning in school. And so they contacted EJI because they couldn't understand why their grandchildren were calling them racist. Then EJI said, well, you need to contact APJMM because they're doing the work in Arkansas. And so that's something that I've found to be very important, is having this information put in front of young people in a digestible way so that they can go out and teach it to their families and to their friends, because they're going to be our secret weapons in getting these people in West Little Rock and Manhattan and other parts that don't seem to get what it is we're talking about right this second.
Yep. Thanks, Kwami. And I just want to thank everyone, all the viewers, for being a part of this. I want to thank all our panelists for being a part of that narrative change. I particularly want to thank Korey for creating something so compelling and powerful and difficult to help us change that narrative. And something you said, Korey, I want us to end on for everyone, and it's in the words of the late great former Arkansan and late Sister Maya Angelou. She said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And Korey, your work makes us feel some sort of way, and the way we need to feel. So thank you all again. And we hope you have a great rest of the evening and a great rest of the National Day of Healing events. So please check out our website at APJMM and check out the rest of the events tomorrow and Friday. And thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Night.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, good night.